the other of greengrocers, but most of them were workers on the Moscow-Brest railway. It was a stone house. All around the dirty and unpaved courtyard ran a wooden passageway. Out of it rose a number of dirty, slippery outside staircases, reeking of cats and cabbage. On the landings were privies and padlocked storerooms. Tiverzin's brother had fought as a conscript in the war and had been wounded at Wafanku. Now he was convalescing at the military hospital in Krasnoyarsk, and his wife and 2 daughters had gone there to see him and to bring him home. The tiverzins, hereditary railway workers, traveled all over Russia on official passes. The flat was quiet. Only Tiverzin and his mother lived in it at present. It was on the 2nd floor. On the landing outside there was a water butt, filled regularly by the water carrier. Tiverzin noticed as he came up that the lid of the butt had been pushed sideways and a tin mug stood on the frozen surface of the water. Prov must have been here, he thought, grinning. The way that man drinks, his guts must be on fire. Prov Afanasievich Sokolov, the church psalmist, was a relative of Tiverzin's mother. Tiverzin jerked the mug out of the ice and pulled the handle of the doorbell. A wave of warm air and appetizing vapors from the kitchen came out to him. "You've got a good fire going, Mother. It's nice and warm in here." His mother flung herself on his neck and burst into tears. He stroked her head and, after a while, gently pushed her aside. "Nothing ventured, nothing won, Mother," he said softly. "The line struck from Moscow to Warsaw. I know. That's why I'm crying. They'll be after you, Kuprinka, you've got to get away. That nice boyfriend of yours, Pyotr, nearly broke my head." He meant to make her laugh, but she said earnestly, "It's a sin to laugh at him, Kuprinka. You should be sorry for him, the poor wretch, the drunkard. Antipov's been arrested. They came in the night, searched his flat, turned everything upside down, and took him away this morning. And his wife Daria's in hospital with the typhus. And their kid, Pasha, who's at the real gymnasium, is alone in the house with his deaf aunt. And they're going to be evicted. I think we should have the boy to stay with us." "What did Prov want? How did you know he came?" "I saw the water butt was uncovered and the mug on the ice sure to have been Prov guzzling water. I said to myself, 'How sharp you are, Kuprinka.' Yes, he's been here. Prov Afanasievich came to borrow some logs. I gave him some. But what am I talking about, fool that I am? It went clean out of my head, the news Prov brought. Think of it, Kuprinka. The Tsar has signed a manifesto and everything's to be changed, everybody's to be treated right, the peasants are to have land, and we're all going to be equal with the gentry. It's actually signed, he says, it's only got to be made public. The synod sent something to be put into the church service, a prayer of thanks or something. He told me what it was, but I've forgotten." 8. Pasha Antipov, whose father had been arrested as one of the organizers of the strike, went to live with the tiverzins. He was a clean, tidy boy with regular features and red hair parted in the middle. He was always slicking it down with a brush and straightening his tunic or the school buckle on his belt. He had a great sense of humor and an unusual gift of observation and kept everyone in fits with his clever imitations of everything he heard and saw. Soon after the manifesto of October 17, several revolutionary organizations called for a big demonstration. The route was from the Tiva Gate to the Kaluga Gate at the other end of the town. But this was a case of too many cooks spoiling the broth. The planners quarreled and one after the other withdrew from participation. Then, learning that crowds had nevertheless gathered on the appointed morning, they hastily sent representatives to lead the demonstrators. In spite of Tiverzin's efforts to dissuade her, his mother joined the demonstrators, and the gay and sociable Pasha went with her. It was a dry frosty November day with a still, leaden sky and a few snowflakes coming down one by one. They spun slowly and hesitantly before settling on the pavement like fluffy grey dust. Down the street people came pouring in a torrent. Faces. Quilted winter coats and sheepskin hats. Men and women, students, old men, children, railwaymen in uniform, workers from the trolley depot and the telephone exchange in knee boots and leather jackets, girls and schoolboys. For some time they sang the Marseillaise, the Varshavianka, and Victims You Fell. Then a man who had been walking backwards at the head of the procession, singing and conducting with his cap, which he used as a baton, turned around, put his cap on his head, and listened to what the other leaders around him were saying. The singing broke off in disorder. Now you could hear the crunch of innumerable footsteps on the frozen pavement. The leaders had received a message from sympathizers that Cossacks were waiting to ambush the procession farther down the street. The warning had been given by telephone to a nearby pharmacy. "What of it?" said the organizers. "We must keep calm and not lose our heads, that's the main thing. We must occupy the first public building we come to, warn the people, and scatter." An argument began about the best building to go to. Some suggested the Society of Commercial Employees, others the Technical School, and still others the School of Foreign Correspondence. While they were still arguing, they reached the corner of a school building, which offered shelter every bit as good as those that had been mentioned. When they drew level with the entrance, the leaders turned aside, climbed the steps of the semicircular porch, and motioned the head of the procession to halt. The doors opened and the procession, coat to coat and cap to cap, moved into the entrance hall and up the stairs. The auditorium, shouted a few voices in the rear, but the crowd continued to press forward, scattering down corridors and straying into the classrooms. When the leaders at last succeeded in shepherding it into the auditorium, they tried several times to warn it of the ambush, but no one listened to them. Stopping and going inside a building were taken as an invitation to an impromptu meeting, which in fact began at once. After all the walking and singing, people were glad to sit quietly for a while and let others do their work for them, shouting themselves hoarse. The crowd, welcoming the rest, overlooked the minor differences between the speakers, who agreed on all essential points. In the end, it was the worst orator of the lot who received the most applause. People made no effort to follow him and merely roared approval at his every word, no one minding the interruptions and everyone agreeing out of impatience to everything he said. There were shouts of shame. A telegram of protest was drafted. And suddenly the crowd, bored with the speaker's droning voice, stood up as one man and, forgetting all about him, poured out in a body, cap to cap and row after row, down the stairs and out into the street. The procession was resumed. While the meeting was on, it had begun to snow. The street was white. The snow fell thicker and thicker. When the dragoons charged, the marchers at the rear first knew nothing of it. A swelling noise rolled back to them as of great crowds shouting hurrah, and individual screams of help and murder were lost in the uproar. Almost at the same moment, and borne, as it were, on this wave of sound along the narrow corridor that formed as the crowd divided, the heads and manes of horses, and their saber-swinging riders, rode by swiftly and silently. Half a platoon galloped through, turned, reformed, and cut into the tail of the procession. The massacre began. A few minutes later the avenue was almost deserted. People were scattering down the side streets. The snow was lighter. The afternoon was dry like a charcoal sketch. Then the sun, setting behind the houses, pointed as though with a finger at everything red in the street, the red tops of the dragoons' caps, a red flag trailing on the ground, and the red specks and threads of blood on the snow. A groaning man with a split skull was crawling along the curb. From the far end of the street to which the chase had taken them, several dragoons were riding back abreast at a walk. Almost at the horse's feet, Marfa Tiverzina, her shawl knocked to the back of her head, was running from side to side screaming wildly. Pasha! Pasha! Pasha had been with her all along, amusing her by cleverly mimicking the last speaker at the meeting, but had vanished suddenly in the confusion when the dragoons charged. A blow from a nagaika had fallen on her back. And though she had hardly felt it through her thickly quilted coat, she swore and shook her fist at the retreating horsemen. Indignant that they had dared to strike an old woman like herself, and in public at that. Looking anxiously from side to side, she had the luck finally to spot the boy across the street. He stood in a recess between a grocer's shop and a private stone house, where a group of chance passers-by had been hemmed in by a horseman who had mounted the sidewalk. Amused by their terror, the dragoon was making his horse perform vaults and pirouettes, backing it into the crowd and making it rear slowly as in a circus turn. Suddenly he saw his comrades riding back, spurred his mount, and in a couple of bounds took his place in the file. The crowd dispersed and Pasha, who had been too frightened to utter a sound, rushed to Marfa Gavrilovna. The old woman grumbled all the way home. "Accursed murderers! People are happy because the Tsar has given 'em freedom, but these damned killers can't stand it. They must spoil everything, twist every word inside out." She was furious with the dragoons, furious with the whole world, and at the moment even with her own son. When she was in a temper, it seemed to her that all the recent troubles were the fault of Kuprinka's bunglers and fumblers, as she called them. What do they want, the half-wits? They don't know themselves, just so long as they can make mischief, the vipers. Like that chatterbox. Pasha dear, show me again how he went on, show me, darling. Oh, I'll die laughing. You've got him to the life. Buzz, 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 a real bumblebee. At home she fell to scolding her son. Was she of an age to have a curly-headed oaf on a horse belt her on her behind? Really, mother, who do you take me for? You'd think I was the Cossack captain or the chief of police. 9. Nikolai Nikolaevich saw the fleeing demonstrators from his window. He realized who they were and watched to see if Yura were among them. But none of his friends seemed to be there, though he thought that he had caught sight of the Dudarov boy. He could not quite remember his name, that desperado who had so recently had a bullet extracted from his shoulder and who was again hanging about in places where he had no business to be. Nikolai Nikolaevich had arrived from Petersburg that autumn. He had no apartment in Moscow and he did not wish to go to a hotel, so he had put up with some distant relatives of his, the Sventitskys. They had given him the corner room on the second floor. The Sventitskys were childless, and the two-story house that their late parents had rented from time immemorial from the Prince's Dolgoruki was too big for them. It was part of the untidy cluster of buildings in various styles with 3 courtyards and a garden that stood on the Dolgoruki's property. Bounded by 3 narrow side streets and known by the ancient name of Flower Town. In spite of its 4 windows, the study was darkish. It was cluttered up with books, papers, rugs, and prints. It had a balcony forming a semicircle around the corner of the house. The double glass door of the balcony was hermetically sealed for the winter. The balcony door and 2 of the windows looked out on an alley that ran into the distance, with its sleigh tracks and the irregular line of its houses and fences. Purple shadows reached into the room from the garden. The trees, laden with hoarfrost, their branches like smoky streaks of candle wax, looked in as if they wished to rest their burden on the floor of the study. Nikolai Nikolaevich stood gazing into the distance. He thought of his last winter in Petersburg Gapon, Gorky, the visit to Prime Minister Witt, modern, fashionable writers. From that bedlam he had fled to the peace and quiet of